This is How to Be a Dungeon Master. And I'd like to first and foremost thank the Bemis Library, the City of Littleton, and our friends at the Littleton Museum and Library for making this possible. This is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart, which you'll find out all about that in just a minute. And I am so delighted to be able to share this with everyone who's joining us today, and for everyone who's going to be viewing this webinar on demand coming forward in the future. So first and foremost, we would like to let you know that yes, we are recording this today. When you signed up through the link that I sent out, your email was captured. We will be sending out, I'm hoping to get this up on YouTube possibly tomorrow, but we will get it to you as soon as possible. Please do keep yourself muted. At the end of the presentation, we decided not to go with raised hands. We're just going to be using the question and answer box. So please refrain from raising hands, just use the question and answer box and we'll get through to as many as possible. And if I don't get to it, there will be an email for you to email me your question directly and we'll talk more. Please remember to use chat, be respectful. Unfortunately, if you are not respectful, we will remove you from the presentation. Sorry. And just a reminder, there are participants of every experience and age level joining us today. So please keep conversations relevant and appropriate. All that being said, we're going to jump right into it. So I'm going to start off by asking you to remember the first time you read your favorite book. And I'm going to use Harry Potter for an example because I think everyone knows Harry Potter, even if you haven't read it yourself. Imagine, if you will, the first time you read about Harry getting his acceptance letter to Hogwarts, about his first trip on the Hogwarts Express, about going into the Chamber of Secrets to rescue Ginny, about going through the Triwizard Tournament, all of these adventures. And while you were there reading the book, it was as if you were living that adventure along with Harry. That is the power of a great story. A great story takes you along for the ride, lets you feel like you're a part of the adventure. And I want to take a second to talk about my story, because my story starts with a little girl who had a very big imagination and not a lot of friends, and a librarian who introduced this girl to a game called Dungeons and Dragons. Back when I was in middle school, I was bullied. I was not really seen, and I didn't know how to express myself except for hyperbole and horrible poetry. Dungeons and Dragons became a creative outlet for me. It became a way for me to express myself, not just the creative side of me, but also the part of me that wanted to be brave, the part of me that wanted to be a wise person. It let me expand who I was through role playing. And there's a reason why psychiatrists and psychologists use role playing. And there's a reason why Dungeons and Dragons has been showing up a lot in psychology and psychiatry and early childhood development. Dungeons and Dragons is a tool for imaginative storytelling. And it's a great way to build connection with others. It's a great way to expand your friend group and find other creative and awesome people. It's a way for people to test drive parts of themselves. I'll use an example of, I know personally several people who are trans folk who have used their Dungeons and Dragons characters to try out what it feels like to call themselves by different pronouns before actually coming out to their families. Dungeons and Dragons is a creative, expressive tool. It lets you, and if you're a librarian, lets your students or your patrons express parts of themselves creatively that they may not otherwise have an outlet for. It's also a great way to explore empathy because you're literally putting yourself into another person's shoes. You are inhabiting another person and imagining, what is it like to be this other person? And of course, above all else, Dungeons and Dragons is a great way to have fun. So we're going to break this down into narrative elements since we're talking about story. So what every great story needs is a narrator, where we're going to talk about exactly what is a dungeon master. Characters, we're going to talk about how a dungeon master interacts with their characters and makes the world work. Plot, we're going to talk about ways for you to find information to run Dungeons and Dragons games, adventures that you can get for free or for pay online. And we're also going to talk about what it's like to build your own stories in your own worlds. Settings, I am actually going to do a short demo of how to use an online tool that I use for my own Dungeons and Dragons games through the Bemis Public Library. Balance is going to be the most sort of like heavy discussion because that's where we're going to talk about rules and sort of like the underlying gist of what the rules are for Dungeons and Dragons. And then inspiration, I'll have some resources, some information, and some great examples of Dungeons and Dragons being played for you to see so you can kind of get an idea as to what you're getting into. So, first and foremost, what is a Dungeon Master? The Dungeon Master is simultaneously the writer, director, and actors in a story that you are writing out chapter by chapter. You are in charge of playing every character that is not run by your players. That includes the dwarf who works at the local inn. That includes the elven princess who's been captured by the orcs. That includes the orcs that actually like didn't care about kidnapping the princess. They just needed to try and get out of the elven city fast, and she happened to be a good bargaining chip. You are all of those people, and you are more. You also are the judge in this world. The world of Dungeons and Dragons is based on rules, and you are the final say in whether or not something happens or doesn't happen according to the rules of the game as you lay out. You're also collaborating with your players. You're not doing this on your own. You're working together with others to create a story that you start, but they ultimately finish. So you are the storyteller, you are the arbiter, and you are the world itself. When you're building your world, you need to remember it isn't just for you. You're building this for your players and your players' characters. So when you're running a game of Dungeons and Dragons, it's important to remember that when you make your game, whether it's a very quick game or whether it's a long-running campaign, you need to remember to keep your characters in mind. If you're going to be helping people make characters for a game of Dungeons and Dragons, be active in creating their characters. Talk to them about how their characters interact in certain social situations. One of my friends used to have a character development sort of tool that he used where he said, your character walks into a tavern. What do they do? And some people, oh, my character decides to hang out in a shadowy corner and watch and see who comes in. Or my character decides to, buy a milkshake and start a fight. Or my character decides to go over and take a nap by the fire because he's so tired from going on this last adventure he was on. Simple things like that, just kind of like letting your players sort of like imagine what their characters are, allow you to also get an insight into who you're going to be dealing with as a player. Being able to take that and then give your player characters moments to shine is the most important thing a Dungeon Master can do. So knowing who your characters are, knowing what motivates them, knowing what scares them, and knowing what can make them stand out and be really, really awesome and impressive are all important things to have in your back pocket as you are taking these characters on this journey. When it comes to doing a good job as a Dungeon Master with your characters, there's a couple things to keep in mind. You want to make sure that you are as descriptive as possible. For a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, it's played solely in the imagination. And if you just say, okay, you go into the room. Okay, they're in the room. There's no description of the room. If you instead say you found your way into a long and tall building, there's a series of curtains along one wall. It looks like maybe there were tapestries that had been ripped to shreds. There's a plinth in the middle of the room with a series of buttons, one of which looks like it might be a handprint sort of shape. And there's this ominous humming sound and you're not sure where it's coming from. The more you can describe a room, the more it makes the players feel like they're actually in the room. You also want to make sure you keep the game moving. It can be very easy in Dungeons and Dragons to get caught up on what we call the crunch. That is to say, the hard rules and the numbers. It's your job to balance the soft elements, the narrative elements, with the hard elements, the rules and the the words I'm trying to say, the important like rule aspects and numbers part of it. Balance, keeping it moving forward, keeping it interesting is very important. And the one most important thing about your characters are going to go off in a weird direction. They always do. If you think that your characters are going to be going to the Dragon's Mountain to try and find the ancient Arkenstone, they're going to end up spending 5 chapters in the forest with Tom Bombadil. I guarantee it. For those of you who don't know Lord of the Rings, I apologize for that terrible joke. Prepare to be totally thrown off by your players, and don't let it faze you. Don't tell them, no, you can't go and do that thing because I'm not prepared for it. If you're not prepared for it, let your players know, I like this idea, I like where this is going. Give me a couple of minutes, or maybe give me, another game session before we play again to figure out where this is going. Characters are volatile and dangerous and the most fun to play with. Now, players can also sometimes cause trouble, and this is the true with any group of friends or any library program or any school program. There will sometimes be someone who wants to run it themselves and wants to get their idea out there before anybody else and wants to talk really over everybody. So make sure as you're running the game as the dungeon master to give everyone a voice and a chance to use that voice. Sometimes individual players can make this difficult. Either they don't want to give everyone their turn, or they don't even realize that they're doing it. And that can cause conflict and tension within the group, like in real life. I'm not talking about, goblins on the side of the road. I'm talking actual real life problems. I always suggest, if you have difficulties with people who are talking over or not giving people the chance to make their voice heard in the actual game, take those people aside and talk to them individually. Often they don't realize that they're doing it. And if you try and correct them in front of everybody, it's a little bit of a jerk move, and it can make them feel really attacked. But if you talk to them individually, it's usually a great way to try and mitigate that sort of shame that they might otherwise feel. And that's another thing about respecting your players. When it comes down to it, your players are trusting you with their time and with their imagination. So when you are building this sort of player, character, and dungeon master dynamic, always try and make sure that you're trying to do things that are good for the group. It's not you versus the players. It's you and the players together, working together to make something awesome. Okay. Claire, are we good on questions so far?
The only one that's still pending is somebody asking about some of the electronic resources other than Roll20, and I believe you will be getting into some of those options in a little bit, correct?
Yeah, we will be. That comes under the setting portion. So, getting out of character and narrator, we're going to start talking about plot. Plot is what I'm using to explain how you actually come around to getting those adventures started. The great thing is that Dungeons and Dragons is a very old game, and there's a whole storied history of information out there for helping you start your campaigns or do a small adventure arc or a one-shot. And you might be asking, what's the difference between a campaign and adventure arc and a one-shot? A one-shot, as it might be described by its name, is meant to be played in one sitting. It usually takes between 2 to 4 hours, depending upon how fast you're playing and how detailed you want to get into the story. These are great for use in educator programs, library programs, or if you're maybe like visiting family or friends and you just want to have, one quick game that you can get through, get into, get out and have fun. An adventure arc is usually either a collection of a number of one-shots that sort of like weave together, or they might be something that you come up with as part of a larger campaign setting, and it's only just like a small portion of the campaign setting. Most of these can be played over the course of a couple of sessions. They're great for monthly clubs and groups for libraries, or again, they're great for friend groups if you want to try and have an adventure that goes for a little bit longer. Now, campaigns. Campaigns are the sort of thing that can stretch on literally for years. I just watched a short documentary about a gentleman in Canada who's been playing the same game of Dungeons and Dragons for, I think he said 35 years, which, I mean, that's goals right there for me. I'll be honest, that's impressive right there. These are best done with a dedicated group of players, people who are going to consistently be present for your gaming sessions. And so far as gaming sessions go, there's no hard and fast rule on how long they have to be or how often they have to be. My sweet spot I've found is usually between 2 to 4 hours at a time, and usually no less than once every other week. But that's me personally. And if you're doing this as a monthly program or something, you could always change that up.
We had one question on the one shot. Somebody asked, is 4 hours too long for a virtual program, giving newbies and a new DM screen fatigue, causing arguments, etc.? Can you get enough done in 2 hours, and why not 1 hour?
So I believe that you could certainly do it in 1 hour. Dungeons and Dragons does take some time because a lot of it is a conversation. So imagine for a minute that you're having a really in-depth conversation with someone. If you feel like you can get everything that you need said in 5 minutes, then you can take 5 minutes. I find personally that anything less than 2 hours, you tend to feel like you didn't really get into it. And again, that's going to depend entirely upon the next part of this that we're going into, where you find pre-made adventures. There are some pre-made adventures that are written to be done in an hour or possibly even less. Most of those are rather violent and don't actually involve a lot of investigation or diplomacy, I'll say. I think 4 hours, I can see the argument that 4 hours might be too long, especially right now with screen fatigue. I will say from personal experience, we did 3 sessions of Dungeons and Dragons in the last month. Yes, 3 sessions of Dungeons and Dragons in the last month, and we did them for 3 hours at a time. And the kids didn't seem to have any difficulty staying focused on the screen for 3 hours. Again, you have to remember, they're not really looking at the screen. They're kind of living in their imagination at the time. So again, it's really up to the, I guess, stamina and the screen time limits for each individual. So I'm going to continue on to where to find pre-made adventures. So a pre-made adventure is an adventure that someone, it's you know, if you can't make your own, store-bought is fine. Which I say store-bought, most of these can be found online for free, actually. A pre-made adventure can be found in a number of places. One of my favorite places to find it is through the Dungeon Masters Guild, which I don't have the link for it on here, but I will make sure to link that in the copy of the slides that I send out after the fact. The Dungeon Masters Guild is a website. It's a sales portal for PDFs of different materials to run Dungeons and Dragons games. A number of these are pay what you want, or they're very inexpensive. And the great thing about the Dungeon Masters Guild is that it has content that is both created by Wizards of the Coast, the publishers of Dungeons and Dragons, and by individuals who are just fans of the game. So you can get one of the official Adventurers League modules where it has very defined rules about, you know, what kind of loot you get. It has very defined information about how long it should take, because Adventurers League is something that that Dungeons and Dragons actually creates in order to try and help facilitate organized play. I'll get into Adventurers League in just a little bit here. Or you can find one that's made by someone who just loves Dungeons and Dragons, has a story they want to share, and writes out sort of the beats of their story, suggesting how you run their game. So you can find those pre-made adventures, as I said, through Dungeon Masters Guild. Either pay what you want, usually or if they're the official ones, they will be slightly more expensive. The other place you can find pre-made adventures is through the portal D&D Beyond. D&D Beyond is the official digital tool set of Dungeons and Dragons published by Wizards of the Coast. It allows for you to purchase and then use digital content, including pre-made adventures. And the great thing about it is if you sign up for their subscription, you can share resources that you have purchased with a certain number of campaigns. It's usually 3, but because of the COVID-19 crisis, Dungeons and Dragons has, Wizards of the Coast has actually put forth some effort to try and make it a little bit easier for you to play with more people. You can use it for 5 campaigns instead of 3 for that sharing until the end of May. In addition, D&D Beyond's quarantine resources has a number of free adventure modules that are available. Some of them are only available for a certain amount of time. I think that one of them expires May 16th and some of them don't expire until the end of May. But these include some of their newest featured releases. There is a guide called The Explorer's Guide to Wildmount, and there's an adventure that's been written for that guide that is now free for use on D&D Beyond, which it's a good one. All right.
Yeah, so, a clarification on there, yes. Emily, asking, what do you mean shared across campaigns?
Sure. So what that means, if you have content and you create a campaign on D&D Beyond and you invite players to your campaign, you are then able to share your unlocked digital content with them, which means that if they are on D&D Beyond and they're searching for information, they'll be able to access and view that information that you have unlocked because they are in a shared campaign with you. I can explain more about that in the Q&A portion of that, though, if that's okay. All right. Okay, so I'm going to move on to campaign settings. So we talked about the things that you can get through the Dungeon Masters Guild and through D&D Beyond. These are also available through D&D Beyond, but they are best known because they come in those great big awesome books with the fancy covers. Campaign settings are a compendium of information to allow you to take your characters through an adventure that can take 10 sessions or 100 sessions or more, depending upon how in-depth they want to get into the stories. These are official guidebooks that are based around certain locations or plot devices. They have plot hooks, they have a cast of non-player characters, maps, and random encounter tables that you can use. Those random encounter tables allow you to easily set out challenges for your players without having to delve too deep into trying to go through the guide and find, what sorts of monsters might be in this area. Let's see. And now I want to talk a little bit about the homebrew option. Homebrew is a blanket term that we use for any game that is not officially published by Wizards of the Coast. Now, what I mean by that is it is a world that you build yourself. That means that you have to come up with the non-player characters and you have to come up with the monsters that your players are going to be fighting and things like that. The great thing about this is you can make Dungeons and Dragons whatever you want. I have a couple of examples of some campaigns that I know people have played in. You can adapt existing stories to fit into the world of Dungeons and Dragons. I personally know people who have run Harry Potter Dungeons and Dragons games, Stranger Things Dungeons and Dragons games, and there is an official Stranger Things adventure module through Wizards of the Coast. I've run it, it's fantastic. This was a little bit more in-depth and very 80s. I know someone who's run a historical setting where they actually use Vikings as the sort of basis for their characters. There have been a couple of people I know who've run anime inspired, including a Sailor Moon game that went on for about 5 years. Pokemon games, the possibilities are endless. You can take the core rules of Dungeons and Dragons and adapt it to whatever flavor you or your players want to play in. Okay, so now we're getting into the question of how do we play this game? And I am going to talk specifically about Roll20, but we can talk a little bit more about some other platforms. Other than Roll20, I don't have much experience with others. I'm mostly going off of my personal experience of what I've used, especially with the most recent games we've been doing at my library. That being said, when it comes to doing Dungeons and Dragons remote, you can literally use any platform you'd use to do a video call. You don't even necessarily need video. You could always just play over voice through a Discord server or something like that. So I've used Zoom to great effect, screen sharing to show maps and move around tokens in D20 in a Roll20. Google Hangouts, I've also seen people use that to great effect. You can use some of the sort of whiteboard capabilities. I think in Google Hangouts I've seen to use that. Discord is very popular for use with playing Dungeons and Dragons, and in fact D&D Beyond is developing a integrated chat bot with Discord to make it easier for people to play D&D through Discord. And of course, Facebook Messenger or any other messenger applications that you'd use could be used to facilitate a Dungeons and Dragons game. As I said, my experience is with Roll20, so I'm going to be showing a quick demonstration of that. Before I jump into the demo, Claire, are there any questions? Questions or clarification?
Just scan through several I've been answering, but you can take a look later and see if I got it correct.
All right.
I think that's it for now.
Okay, so I'm going to hop over to Roll20. There we go. All right. So Roll20 is a very versatile tool. It allows you to create a campaign setting, and it allows you to import maps and tokens and all sorts of great things. So I'm going to show you an example. This is a brand new account that I've just made today. We're going to click here where it says create a new game. And the great thing is you can name this whatever you want. It's going to pop up something silly for me because I just ran a campaign where I named it, put that thing back where it came from. Some of the kids who are in the chat know this because they played in that game. I'll say, let's see here, the Dragons Horde. All right, you don't have to do tags, but I always put in the fact that it's D&D, and we're going to create our game. All right, so the platform here is not the important thing. The important thing is when you get in and launch the game. Because this is a free account, it does have ads that you have to sort of sit through, but there are paid subscriptions you can use to remove the ads. It's not really a huge deal because it literally takes maybe 15 seconds before your screen pops up. So this is the grid. The grid is the place where you're going to be building your game that you're going to be playing. And right now, it's pretty much just an empty grid. The great thing is, this is the starting place. You get to put anything you want in here, and you do that by going in to the art library. And there are things you can purchase. You can purchase subscriptions, and then there's also free assets. And the free assets are very versatile. There's a whole lot of stuff in here. You can grab, let's see here. If you want a bat, you can put a bat. You can unstretch the bat so it doesn't look quite so silly. If you need some bad guys, you can bring in some bad guys. There's a couple kobolds. It's kind of boring here because it's still just a white void. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna do what every good researcher does and hit Google. If you literally search for Dungeons and Dragons maps, you can find just about anything. So I'm gonna say, let's look for Dungeons and Dragons. Let's see here, trap dungeon. If we go into images, should have put map, trap dungeon map. There are all of these different great maps that you can use. I'm gonna grab this one here. Save it to my desktop. And then if I go back into Roll20, if I come up here to my library, I can upload this file. Ostensibly, I can upload this file.
Never fails.
You're not wrong. Okay. If it's
Well,
here we go. So I upload the file, and then as soon as the file is in, I can drag it out and turn this into an actual location where our kobolds and our bat and our, would-be heroes can all hang out.
Ellie, we do have a question about, prior to getting all of this set up, do you need to know what the adventure campaign will be? How much prep work have you done before you get to the point of setting up your map and everything?
That is a very good question, and the answer is a little bit finicky. And the reason it's a little bit finicky is you can have an entire game planned out and know exactly where you think it's going to go. And if your players don't go in that direction, it can sort of require some quick thinking and readjusting of what you have at your disposal in order to make the game happen. I would say, for the most part, if you're a teacher or a librarian or other form of educator, you can usually plan on like having the students follow more or less what you're planning. If you're a casual gamer with a bunch of friends who like to throw you curveballs, I honestly think the less you have planned, the easier it is. I will say this much, it's always a good idea to have an idea of the possible directions where your players can go. So let's say if I put my players in a village and told them that there was a fascinating dungeon, this dungeon we've just created here, for them to go and investigate. Well, I also know that there's a couple of different things happening around in the town that might be more interesting to them. So the more you have available for your players to go and do, kind of the easier it is for you to pick up and run in one direction or the other. This is a skill that you develop with time. This is something that the longer you play Dungeons and Dragons and the more you get comfortable with being able to tell an improvised story with very little preparation, the easier it becomes. And I'm going to do a little bit of a spoiler here. There's a part later on in this presentation where I say, you're not going to be perfect in the beginning. And that's perfectly okay, because you are learning as a dungeon master a set of skills that are going to be important for you bringing joy and fun to people in the future. And it's going to take some time to develop that skill set, just like it would for any other skill set.
And then one follow-up on that, you want to have several preset challenges and discoveries available so that you can improvise as needed.
That is my suggestion. My suggestion is sort of expect to be thrown off course and expect to have to go in a different direction, because invariably your players will do that. This isn't like a lesson plan. This isn't like a definitive, first you're going to learn addition, then you're going to learn subtraction, then you're going to learn, multiplication and division. This is, hey, let's try trigonometry just because it looks cooler. So the more you have sort of like in your mind where you can move your players into, the easier it becomes.
And then following on that, can you have multiple maps prepared ahead of time on Roll20?
Absolutely, I would love to show you that. So up here, there's this page toolbar. Page toolbar is where you create new pages. And you'll notice here this little red bookmark says players. You can literally have, 2, 3, 4, 5 pages, even more set up. And then depending upon where you want your players to be able to see, you can have different things. So as you move the bookmark, your players would then be seeing this screen instead. And we can go in and, I don't know, throw a great big dragon or something. So my point is, yes, you can have a lot prepared on Roll20. It gives you a chance, like I said, to be prepared for whatever craziness your players are going to come throwing at you. I'd like to talk about one more thing on Roll20, because we find ourselves in a location in a time and place where some kids may not have access to the dice that they would normally use for D&D. There's a great tool on Roll20 that you can use. Under settings, you can enable something called 3D dice. And it allows you, when you roll, and you roll by clicking over here, and it gives you the option of rolling a 4-sided dice, a 6-sided dice, 8-sided dice, 10-sided dice, 12-sided dice, 20-sided dice. If you click on the D20, it actually lets you roll a physical dice. And that can be a lot of fun for the kids. So if the kids don't have their own dice at home, or if your friends don't have their own dice at home, this is a great way to sort of still have that visual and physical feel of rolling the dice, which I have been told personally by someone very close to me is the best part of the game. It also makes a really fun whoop sound, which I adore. All right, so I'm going to move along from D20, from Roll20 for now. I will say that there are a number of really fantastic tutorials that they have on Roll20. So if you are interested in utilizing this as a tool for your own groups, there is a wealth of information to assist you with the learning curve there. And I did get a question about what's the learning curve for Roll20. I would say if you want to do a lot of the really fancy stuff, it takes some getting used to. But if you want to just make simple maps that your characters can run around in, it's quite simple.
And 2 clarification questions on Roll20.
Yes.
One said, never mind, they're going to look for tutorial. The other was saying, are you able to only reveal certain parts of the map as you go along, like a single room?
Yes, you are. That is a function called Fog of War. I am going to, if you'd like, if you want to email me, my email will be at the bottom of the question and answer portion. If you'd like to email me, I can try and find some tutorials for how to use Fog of War. But again, tutorials are found on their website. It's a very well laid out sort of, this is how you be awesome at Roll20. All right, so moving right along. Okay, we're gonna get into balance. Balance, I think, when it comes to rules, this is one of the parts that's really scary for people. The very basic explanation of Dungeons and Dragons is this. The Dungeon Master starts off by describing the environment that the players have found themselves in. That can include anything from the time of day, the space, the actual physical space that they find themselves in, smells or sounds or sensations that they have in that place. They can describe monsters or people who are present in this area. After the Dungeon Master has described these things, the players then describe their desired action. So let's go back to that room with the torn tapestries and the plinth. Let's say one person wants to go over and inspect the tapestries. Another person wants to maybe sit down and start playing on their musical instrument. And another person wants to investigate that plinth with the hand mark on it. Any one of those characters might be discovering something. And then after they describe what they want to do, the dungeon master then narrates the result. So if the person going over to inspect the tapestries has something interesting that they find, the dungeon master explains, you go over there and you find that these tapestries have actually not been shredded, they've just fallen apart with age. Clearly this room hasn't been visited in quite some time, and the ravages of time have taken their toll on these tapestries. Or maybe the person who's sitting down and playing on their musical instrument, the dungeon master might say, you start playing, but while you're doing that, you notice that there's a sound, an echoing of your music that doesn't seem quite natural in this space. And maybe it means that there's like a secret door over to one side where it's, the echoes are bouncing off of the wall in there. Maybe the person who's investigating the plinth finds out that once they put their hand on the button, it lets out a horrible horde of hairy spiders. And now we've got to roll for initiative, which means bad stuff has begun. And that gets me into the dice. Dice are not always necessary. I have in fact known some very old school gamers who play Dungeons and Dragons without the use of dice. What they do is they judge whether or not a character's natural ability means that they would be able to overcome a certain challenge. And they sort of like talk it through. It's very lawyery and kind of an elegant way to play Dungeons and Dragons, in my opinion. But again, I've been told by someone very near and dear to me that rolling the dice is the best part. So when it comes to dice, dice is the way for you to inject an element of chance and randomness into your story. Your characters, your players, when they create their character sheets, have different abilities and ability scores. Depending upon how good their abilities are one way or another, they might be very well suited to doing a certain task, or they might not be very good at that task. The dice is their chance to sort of have fate intervene. So when a person is playing Dungeons and Dragons and they want to do something, I'm going to use the example of someone wants to shoot their bow and arrow into the horrible hairy horde of spiders. They will roll their dice and they will add the relevant modifiers. In this case, they'll be adding their attack modifiers, which is a whole bunch of math, which again, this is mostly about the actual function of being a dungeon master and not about the actual rules themselves. This is sort of just an overview on this case. So they'll roll the dice, they'll add whatever modifiers, if there's any bonuses or penalties, because maybe it's a super awesome bow, or maybe it's a very dark room and you can't really see very well. Any of those bonuses or penalties will be added. And then you compare the final result of that dice roll plus the modifiers, plus any bonuses or penalties against the target number, which we normally call a DC or difficulty class. If you're trying to attack something, we call it an armor class, just because you're trying to overcome their armor rather than a certain difficulty level. Again, all of this information is available in the books, and we'll be talking about the books, I think now, yes. So the books themselves are kind of the core of Dungeons and Dragons. And there's three kinds of official books. There are the core rule books, which we'll be talking about in just a moment, supplemental rule books, which are very fancy and offer a bunch of really awesome like customizations and new monsters and extra bells and whistles. They are not necessary, but they are a lot of fun. And there are also campaign guides, which we talked about in the last bit. The campaign guides, while they don't often apply new rules, they have their own sort of like internal rules about the campaign setting, about the monsters and the non-player characters that are part of that campaign setting. I need a drink of water. Sorry. Claire, are there any questions while I'm getting a drink of water?
Nope, we're clear on the question front. We did have one comment in the chat reminding everybody that learning the digital platforms is the easy part, and mastering all of the rules and parameters and nuances of the actual game is what will take you a lifetime.
I could not agree more. And I've been doing this for 20 years. So, I mean, all right, getting back to the core rule books. In order to play Dungeons and Dragons, you at the very least need a Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook. The Player's Handbook is what your players are going to be using to create their characters. This gives you all of the rules for creating a halfling rogue or a elven druid or a tiefling warlock. And if all of these sound really cool, it's because they are. It gives you information for gear that your characters might be purchasing before they set out on their quest. It gives you information about some of the basic sort of structures of magic. It gives you a list of spells that your character might be able to cast if they're a spell casting class. It gives you all the basic information your players will need in order to create the characters that are then going to play in your world. That's where the Dungeon Master's Guide comes in. The Dungeon Master's Guide is a very complicated book because you can get so sucked into it because there's a lot of information and a lot of great resources to help you build the world that your players are going to be working in. I encourage you to use its information and use its resources for you. Don't be stuck making sure that you do everything by the book. Let the book work for you, not you work for the book. I hope that makes sense. That being said, once you have made your world, you're going to need all sorts of delightful monsters and monstrosities to bother your players. And the Monster Manual is where you find those. The Monster Manual is laid out alphabetically, and it can be really easy just to kind of like go through and say, oh, this monster looks good. Let's have them fight a beholder. That sounds awesome. The Monster Manual is very helpful, but if you don't understand how to read it, it can be very dangerous for your players. You can very easily unbalance a encounter and have your players dead very quickly. Oh, I forgot this part. We'll get into the balancing combat encounters in just a moment. But the question about where do you get these books? I would like to take a moment to plug your local friendly brick and mortar game store, especially now more than ever. In Colorado, in the Denver area, there are a number of really fantastic small game stores. I strongly suggest that you purchase your gaming supplies from them. It is an industry that needs all the support it can get. Of course, if you don't have a friendly local brick and mortar game store, there are all manner of online retailers and big box bookstores that you can find these at. I know for a fact that your Barnes & Noble and your Amazon both have Dungeons & Dragons books. I also strongly suggest digital copies. And the main reason I suggest digital copies, it's so much easier to Control F find things rather than sitting there and flipping through the book and flipping through the book and flipping through the book. So I would like to suggest digital copies if this is your first foray into Dungeons & Dragons, because it makes it much easier for you to find rules. As I was talking about D&D Beyond, you can actually purchase virtual copies of the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual, and the Player's Handbook in a bundle that's actually fairly reasonably priced. You can also get virtual copies in PDF form through the Dungeon Masters Guild. You can even purchase a number of these campaign guides, and I believe that the core rule books are also available through Roll20, as well as other online purveyors of game books like DriveThruRPG. Now, this is probably the most important thing I'm going to say in this entire presentation. Right now, because of the COVID-19 crisis, Wizards of the Coast has the Digital Club Support Program. And if you are a qualifying educator or librarian or other person running a club for particularly younger audiences, you can actually apply and get a free digital book bundle. And this is what they call the Legendary Bundle. It unlocks, I think, literally everything on their website. I will be linking to that through the through the presentation. So once you get the link for the presentation, there will be links to the slides, and the information to access that will be through the slides as well. It is a very useful tool to have, as I said before, because it allows you to search for rules rather than having to go through and find the rules in the books, which can take a little bit longer. So I'm gonna roll it back because I meant to talk about balance in combat. So there's one rule that I think I'm going to talk about here because I feel like a lot of people like Dungeons and Dragons because of the fighting. But it can be very easy to either underwhelm or overwhelm your party depending upon whether or not you understand what's called the challenge rating. On every entry in the monster manual, there is a statistics block for the monster, which includes a value called their challenge rating. Challenge rating indicates what level of adventuring party should be able to take it on. So a party of adventurers, they average about 4 for this calculation. A well-rested and well-prepared party of 4 adventurers should be able to take on a monster at challenge rating equal to their own level with no deaths. Now, here's a for instance. I've got a lovely picture of a chimera here. A chimera in the monster manual is challenge rating 6, which means that a well-provisioned and well-prepared party of 4 6th level players should be able to take on a chimera without much difficulty. Now, that same party of 4 6th level players would not be able to take on something like an adult red dragon, which I think has a challenge rating of 22, something atrocious, I remember. And also, if you just throw rats at them, they're going to be very bored because a rat has a challenge rating of like, I think 1/4. So you'd have to throw a lot of rats at a party of 6th level players in order to make them feel like they were having any fun. So challenge rating is the one thing that I always try and express to new dungeon masters. If you're trying to make your combats fun, make sure you pay attention to the level of your players. I'm going to tell a personal anecdote right now. We had a friend of ours run a Dungeons and Dragons game in which he threw a cloud giant at us. We were level 4, and a cloud giant is much higher challenge rating than level 4. My character literally ended up burying herself under a boulder that this giant threw at her. It was epic, which I'd like to point out, it doesn't necessarily need to be that you only have fun if you win. Some of my favorite memories of Dungeons and Dragons happen when I'm actually on the losing side. It's a funny thing when the experience, whether it's a win or a lose, is the thing. It's always different every time you play D&D. And sometimes a win can be just as fun as a loss. I'm going to get back to balance and talking about tools to help you create a balanced encounter. There are 2 tools that I use to ensure that the challenge that I'm throwing my players is not going to overwhelm or underwhelm them. One of those is a website called Kobold Fight Club. Kobold Fight Club uses the information from the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual to basically create a scaled challenge rating table where you're able to say, I have a party with 4 3rd level players and 1 5th level player, and I need to know what would be a easy challenge for them, what would be a moderate challenge for them, and what would be a deadly challenge for them. And it will actually give you a number of foes to throw at them, depending upon their challenge rating level. And then you're able to just use those. It makes it very easy. It takes so much less time than trying to go through the entire book yourself, searching for exactly what monster you want to throw at them. It is such a good tool that D&D Beyond has actually adapted it, and they actually have a beta encounter builder, which you'd be able to use and try to do the same thing. If you plug in what your party level is, and you search for different monsters, if you click on the monster, it'll tell you whether or not pitting your party against this is going to totally kill them, or if it's going to be a walk in the park, or if it's going to be a good challenge. So again, using the tools that are available to you, and the D&D the encounter builder on D&D Beyond is free with a free not subscription, a free account. You don't have to be subscribed to be able to use that. All you need is a free account. Okay. So we're going to talk again about the Dungeon Master, because we have kind of an idea as to what a Dungeon Master does. A Dungeon Master makes the rules, and the Dungeon Master makes the world, and the Dungeon Master, you know, tells the players what happens. But the question is, how do you be a good Dungeon Master? Because you could very easily sit in a room or sit on a Zoom call and, you know, say, you roll to hit, you hit, okay, next person. You roll to hit, you hit. You can very easily make this very boring. And there's a couple of tricks to make sure that you are engaging and keeping your players engaged. And the first one is to actively listen. When you are playing with your players, always know that they are the engine that drives the game. You have to be able to know what they're thinking and what they're wanting and what they're needing in order to move the game forward. Collaboration with your players is also important. It's very, very tempting when you're in charge of literally the universe to say, this is happening this way because I said so. It's very important to sort of let the players in on kind of what's going on. That doesn't mean giving away all the secrets. Secrets are very important when you're running a game because you want to keep the suspense building. You want to keep your players engaged and excited. But letting them be part of sort of the magic, kind of letting them like get a peek behind the Dungeon Master screen every now and again is a really great way to sort of keep them feeling like in awe, but also like in on the story. Improvisation I've mentioned before. Being a good Dungeon Master is very much like being in improv theater. You are taking what your players are giving you and you are spinning it into an entirely different path for your story sometimes. And that comes down to a rule, again from improv theater, the yes and rule. Anytime someone gives you a prompt in Dungeons and Dragons, that is to say, let's say your half-elf rogue decides that he doesn't want to hang out with the party at this banquet they've been invited to. Let's say the rogue wants to go off and maybe search for treasure in this house while everyone else is downstairs in the banquet hall. You can say, okay, yes, you do that. And as the story progresses, if this rogue isn't sneaky enough, the and for that becomes, well, yes, and you get caught, and now you're in trouble because the Baron turns out is actually a vampire. And now what are you going to do? Because you've been caught totally red-handed stealing from the coffin of this vampire lord. So the yes and is important, but there's also a mitigating factor to that, and I call that the yes but. And yes, every time I say that, my fiance giggles. The yes but is you not shutting down your players. When a player asks to do something, you are it's very easy to say, no, you don't get to do that. And that kills the fun immediately. So if a person wants to do something, perhaps not the wisest course of action, my suggestion is to say, yes, you can do that. But if you do that, this might happen. Or yes, you do that, but then this thing happens. So let's say you've got someone who wants to, let's say that your players are in a tall castle and there's a band of goblins that are coming to attack the palace. Let's say that your druid with the inside of her flying squirrel friends wants to dive from the top of the palace and try to glide down to intercept the goblins. Yes, you can do that, but it's going to be very difficult, and I hope you roll very high, because if you don't, you are going to be squirrel paced. You see where I'm going with this. It's not about shutting down the bad ideas, it's about allowing for the ideas to happen and then dealing with the consequences. And that's something that you are going to learn over time. This is not something that most people are naturally perfectly good at. I would say no human is naturally perfectly good at running something solely from your imagination like this. You will not be perfect at first, and that is perfectly okay. This is a set of skills that you will be growing and developing and refining for years to come, I hope, because I hope that you find D&D to be something that is valuable and is important, especially when it comes to people who are working with children and teenagers, because this is, without a doubt, one of the most valuable growing tools that I have found. I might be biased because it was, my growing tool, but I know plenty of kids who have used Dungeons and Dragons as a way to find themselves and build themselves and learn more about themselves and learn more about their friends. And it's a fantastic game, and I do hope that it is of value to you. So I'm going to talk about some things that we have for inspiration. I clearly have only talked for about an hour, and I'm not going to cover every bit of information that we have to talk about here. So I'm also providing you some further tools from people that I actually have watched and studied and found very helpful. First and foremost, I would love to suggest a series called GM Tips, which was published by, I'm sorry, Siri thought I was talking at her. Sorry, Siri. We're going to talk about GM Tips, which is published by Geek and Sundry. It is a phenomenal series of videos published by Matt Mercer and Satine Phoenix, who are probably two of the best dungeon masters professionally that I've ever seen. Handbook or Helper by Critical Role is also partially produced by Matthew Mercer. That is, GM Tips focuses more on the dungeon master side of things and is also applicable to other games other than Dungeons and Dragons. Handbook or Helper deals more with player character elements, but is also very important because you as a dungeon master will kind of need to start learning a little bit more about how your player characters are going to function and what's important for them when they're rolling dice or recruiting their characters or such. I would also love to suggest a YouTube channel by a dungeon master by the name of Matthew Colville. Matthew Colville has been playing Dungeons and Dragons forever. He is very talented, he is very knowledgeable, and I think he's very funny as well. He has a number of series on his channel about how to be a dungeon master, about how to run certain encounters in certain ways. He also has campaign diaries where he talks about his personal game and what's going on in it. Another great thing for inspiration is just to see someone else playing Dungeons and Dragons. And the great thing is there's this cottage industry of live play D&D that has totally exploded in the last couple of years. And one of the best examples of that is Critical Role. Critical Role has been filming and putting out weekly episodes of Dungeons and Dragons for the last 5 years. They have over, I think, 300 episodes, each one clocking in at least 4 hours. So, I mean, if you want something to do with your quarantine, there you go. The cool thing about Critical Role is that they are, they're run by Matthew Mercer, who I mentioned before, but all the players are voice actors. And so they're very just adept at improv, and they're very funny, and they're very like serious at times. They do amazing things with their characters. And the great thing is because they're all friends in real life, their interactions in the game are so just genuine and heartfelt. For those of you who are younger with us, I will warn you there is some language in Critical Role that might be a little iffy. Make sure you check with your parents first. D20 Dames and Maze Arcana are two others. These ones are family friendly. D20 Dames is only through voice, so it's just a podcast that you listen to. It is an all-female cast with a very complex and really well-run game system that they do. Maze Arcana is run by Satine Phoenix, also from the GM tips that I mentioned before. Maze Arcana is actually an official live play from Dungeons and Dragons itself. So it's run through the Wizards of the Coast Twitch channel, and it is phenomenal. The Dungeon Master Satine Phoenix specifically wanted to create a female-empowered world that her twin nieces could listen to. So it's very family-friendly. It's very empowering to watch these characters. It is just I can't tell you how much fun it is to watch a show like this, because there's no contrivance. There's no, certainty as to where things are going. When you're watching a show like this, literally anything can happen. And I think that's one of the things I love best about shows, and specifically about running Dungeons and Dragons. It's a story where literally anything can happen. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of alternatives to Dungeons and Dragons, because if D&D feels overwhelming, it is probably for the uninitiated and for those who are feeling overwhelmed. I think it's great to have alternatives to sort of like slip into that realm of running role-playing games before maybe tackling something big as Dungeons and Dragons. To that end, Mice and Mystics is a board game which has a very Dungeons and Dragons flavor. Your players are heroes of the realm that have been captured by an evil sorceress and turned into mice, and you're trying to navigate your way through the palace, trying to save the king and save the country from this evil sorceress. It's very Dungeons and Dragons flavor and very, very easy and accessible. The Fate system is another alternative. The Fate system, while I wouldn't say it's necessarily easier than Dungeons and Dragons, it's a little bit more accessible because there's a lot less to do with rules specifically. The Fate system deals quite a lot more with story-based elements. And all of the rules are available for free online. So if your concern is a price point, Fate system might be a good option for you. And the great thing about Fate system is that it doesn't have a setting in the same way that Dungeons and Dragons does. You can adapt the Fate setting to literally any story you want to tell. And there are supplements to assist you in creating a science fiction Fate story, or a horror mystery Fate story, or even like, an Oran High School Host Club Fate story. Possibilities are endless. And for some people, they have difficulty with action and adventure or violence portrayed on human or humanoid characters. And to that end, I would like to suggest Pugmire. Pugmire is run on the same 20-sided dice system as Dungeons and Dragons, but it's Dungeons and Dragons and doggos. This is a post-apocalyptic future, far into the future, where dogs have been uplifted. They now use technology and have language and logic, and they work in the world in the same way that your clerics and your paladins and your fighters and your rogues in Dungeons and Dragons do. And it's the ever-ending quest to determine, are you a good dog or a bad dog? And it's a fantastic, especially if you're dealing with concerns about violence in video games, or violence toward humans in programming with your kids. Pugmire is a great alternative. Couple more things. There was a wonderful sort of supplement created by a publishing company called Monty Cook Games, called Consent in Gaming. I won't go into it in super detail, but I will say one of the great things about Dungeons and Dragons is that it does allow you to grapple with some mature topics. And if you find yourself in a position where you're not sure whether or not the story you want to tell is appropriate with your players, Consent in Gaming is a great resource to go to sort of like consider, even for something as simple as whether or not someone's afraid of spiders or afraid of snakes. Talking about consent, even for small things like subject matter or certain monsters or themes that you're going to be dealing with is an important thing to keep in mind. The Animated Spellbook is another YouTube channel that I very much enjoy. It's not necessarily a how-to dungeon master sort of thing. It includes a lot of information about specific spells from the Dungeons and Dragons spellbook. It also has information on certain aspects of the rules and how things work. It also has a number of sort of like campaign diary animations. Again, for our younger viewers, there is some language issues on here. Check with your parents first, kids. And the last one I would like to suggest is a blog called The Monsters Know What They're Doing, which has also been adapted into a very great book by the same name by Keith Ammonen. I hope I pronounced that right. Because as you start progressing as a dungeon master and you start considering, okay, well, my players are going into a dungeon with these sorts of monsters. These monsters are getting kind of boring. What can I do to make them more interesting? And the great thing about The Monsters Know What They're Doing is it allows you to apply logic, and it allows you to apply interesting aspects of like the lore of the world of Dungeons and Dragons into why do lizard folk act the way that they do, or why do giants act the way that they do. It's a very powerful tool for bringing more like verisimilitude into your story, making the story feel more real. So there are a couple of roadblocks that I've personally heard people say keep them from being a dungeon master. And the biggest roadblock I have heard has to be that being a dungeon master is hard because you have to know every rule in the books. I'm going to tell you right now, for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast has over 120 officially printed books and supplements and rules errata, and nobody's got time for that. If you know the basics, if you understand the basics of roll the dice, add the modifiers, add any sort of bonuses or detriments, and then compare it to the number, you're already halfway there. If you have the books and you have the ability to sort of read and understand them and understand like how an index works, you're able to find basically anything that you're going to need. But here's the thing. D&D is meant to be fun. And if it becomes a job where you're just looking up rules all the time, you're going to derail your story, you're going to derail your players. So the important thing to know is that the rules are yours to make or break. What I think is more important is internal consistency rather than by the book accuracy. That is to say, if there's a rule in Dungeons and Dragons that doesn't make sense to you or that you don't feel like it adds anything to it, so long as you and your players are in agreement, you can disregard that rule. And as long as you're consistent in that ruling, that's really the important thing. In addition, if you have difficulty with the rules, there are tools to help you. In addition to those searchable PDFs or websites like D&D Beyond, you can find inexpensive Dungeon Master screens through your local friendly gaming shop or online. Before I started using Dungeon Master screens, I would actually write out flashcards for myself to remind myself of different rules. This was back in 3.5 edition, and that was a very clunky, rules-heavy sort of beast. I won't bother you with those stories. But there's all manner of different ways that you can find the information easily, quickly, and to keep your play rolling. So that's roadblock number 1. So don't think that you have to know every single rule to be able to be the dungeon master. The second roadblock is people think that D&D is really expensive, and they see some of these live play shows where there are these fantastic, enormous pieces of terrain and these like detailed and awesome miniatures, and they think, I'm gonna have to get all of that to be able to run Dungeons and Dragons. Absolutely not the case. As we just demonstrated right now, you can run D&D online with just a website with very basic interface. There are all sorts of other different tools you can use online to run Dungeons and Dragons. When you're back in person playing D&D, you don't need a big fancy battle map and you don't need big fancy miniatures. You can do DIY very easily. I know friends personally who use chess sets and use the chess miniatures as their player tokens as they move around on the board. I've seen people who print out cardboard standees of the monsters that they're going to be using. All sorts of different things are available. You can very easily DIY a lot of the stuff that you might see in some of these live play shows. And there are a lot of inexpensive online tools with free or trial subscriptions. Roll20 is one of them that I just demonstrated. There are others. We can talk about that a little bit more in Q&A. But again, I have the most experience with Roll20 personally. And of course, there are people who play Dungeons and Dragons without even a map. We call that theater of the mind. Theater of the mind is probably the most basic form that Dungeons and Dragons took. It's the way that they played it back in the very beginning when D&D first started. There were no miniatures and there were no battle maps. Everything was theater of the mind. You described the room, your players told you what they did, then you described what happened after that. One of the tools that my librarian friend who taught me how to play D&D, she would actually have some of our kids who had difficulty maybe on the autism spectrum. She'd actually have them on graph paper mark out and actually like be the cartographer trying to figure out our way to make a map for the dungeon we were in. That's a very fantastic tool. First off, it kind of gives a sense of ownership to the kid who's in charge of being the cartographer that week. Also, it lets you sort of like reveal the mystery to the kids, you know, 5 foot square by 5 foot square as they're adventuring in. It's a very powerful tool and cheap as free. And now the third thing that people think when you're the dungeon master is, I don't want to play it because the only thing you're doing is just trying to kill off your players as fast as possible. And I will admit, I have played in games where that is like the MO. You are playing in a game where your dungeon master is trying to kill you as fast as possible. There's actually a name for that. It's called a meat grinder campaign. And if you want to play that kind of game, you can, but that is absolutely not the point of Dungeons and Dragons. And it's not something that I think any dungeon master should go into assuming. You're the force behind everything that the players are fighting against, but you're also in charge of all the people who are rooting for the players. You're in charge of the people who want to see the characters succeed. I think the most important thing for a dungeon master to do is make sure that you make the game interesting, but not punishing. Because if you make a game where people feel like literally they're going into the game and they're just going to, you know, gird themselves to figure out, you know, how horribly is their character going to die this time, I don't think that's fun for a lot of people. Unless, of course, that's the kind of game that you want to run. And again, all the more power to you. I think the best way to enter being a dungeon master is to imagine that you are your players' biggest fans. And what you're doing is you are creating something for them that they can play in, they can act out in, they can grow in, and they can have a wonderful experience in. Because in the end, you're telling a story for them. You're making the world together, but you're making it for them. And that's really what a dungeon master is. You're telling the story for the people you care about, whether that's your friends, whether that's your family, whether it's your patrons or your students. And it's a great thing to do. So we're going to jump right into the question and answer section. My email address is at the bottom. If there are any questions that you don't have, that you don't want us to cover live on the stream, or if there's a question that I don't get to, do please email me and we'll start from here. Claire, do we have any questions?
We do. We have several questions. Who was asking for a library starting from scratch. Is it okay to have players bring a character, or is it better to meet and make the characters together for a first session?
I think that if you're running a one-shot, it's actually preferable to have your players have their characters ready. If what you would like to do is start a story where either you're doing an adventure arc that you're running, or it's a it's a world that you're making up entirely for a homebrew, I suggest maybe having a chance to create your characters with your patrons. But if it's just a series of one-shots, if you're trying to get in, have as much fun as possible, and then get out in the time it takes to run a program, pre-made is certainly better. And I strongly suggest, as the dungeon master, always having a set of pre-made characters available for your players. That's what we did with my library over the last 3 sessions that we offered. We did online sign up, and if the kids said that they wanted to use a pre-made character, I asked them what class they wanted. They told me, and I gave them 3 different character sheets with sort of different flavors of the character that they wanted to play. So if they told me they wanted to be a warlock, I would give them 3 different warlocks to choose from.
All right. And then a question from Mark. If I want to run a game using one of the campaign guides, do I also need to have the Dungeon Master's Guide?
I strongly suggest it. And the reason why is that the campaign guide will tell you the information for that campaign specifically, but it will assume that you have the Dungeon Master's Guide. So if it talks to you about certain rules like fatigue or like seafaring travel or things like that, most of those rules will be found in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So anytime you're playing, even if you don't have anything else, you need the basic 3. You need the Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and the Dungeon Master's Guide.
All right. A couple questions about the actual mechanics of rolling. What rolls for which actions, and how is that decided? Is it what the DM directs, or is it directed by what the players want to do?
Sure. So that is a bit of a chunky question. I'll give you kind of a basic overview. Generally, when you are rolling, you're doing one of a couple of things. Either you are trying to use one of your skills. Skills are actions that you take that use one of your 6 basic abilities. Your basic abilities are strength, dexterity, charisma, constitution, intelligence, and wisdom. Those are the basic numbers that make up sort of like the statistical block of your character. When you first make your character, you assign certain values to those 6 statistics. And then you figure out certain modifiers depending upon how good or how bad your ability is. You then apply that to your skill, and depending upon whether or not you are trained in a skill, you might have a further bonus to it. So you might be rolling to do a skill. Skills include things like climbing up walls, or playing your musical instrument, or trying to steal from the pocket of a guard, things like that. We'll also be rolling to do what we call saving throws. Saving throws are when you are trying to react in response to something that happens. Usually this is something like you falling down a flight of stairs, or you trying to avoid a giant fireball that's being flung at you, or you trying to shake off the magical mind control that some monster is trying to place over you. So saving throws have set numbers depending upon, again, your attributes. It depends, your ability scores, ability scores. You also will be rolling when you're trying to hit somebody with an attack or a spell usually. There's all manner of times when you would use the roll of the dice. You also use certain dice rolls when you're trying to determine how much damage you do when you attack something, or if you're going to be taking a rest, you will roll a certain amount of dice to determine how much health you can recover during that rest, things like that. So again, this is kind of a chunky question, and I've kind of really made it too simple. This is the information that you'll learn by reading the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook and such.
And then a question about the alternatives to D&D and how to play them virtually. Do you need the map feature like what you have on Roll20 if you want to do one of the other ones?
Sure, and that's the great thing about Roll20 is that it's not necessarily tied to Dungeons and Dragons. I named 3 alternatives to D&D. There are literally hundreds of role-playing games in every flavor. If you want a role-playing game that deals with, let's see here, like there's role-playing games for the Firefly show that, was canceled far too early. There's role-playing games that are literally based around a Tolkien-esque fantasy world. There's role-playing games that are based in a cyberpunk dystopian future where elves and giants both, are trying to, make a living while dragons are secretly like engineering the stock market and things like that. There's all sorts of different crazy, awesome games to be played. And the great thing about Roll20, you don't have to play D&D on Roll20. You can very easily adapt it to use as a way to make battle maps for a science fiction setting or for a dystopian setting or for, for any sort of thing you would want. There's a couple of things you might do while you're in the game itself to make it more suited to the game that you want to play. There's actually the ability to roll fate dice from the fate system I was talking about through Roll20. So you're able to adapt Roll20 to play the fate system very easily.
Right, and we just had a note in the chat as well that there's a list of role-playing games on the ALA's website for the Games and Gaming Roundtable. So
Yep.
those librarians among us. And then a question about using an existing game board such as Risk in lieu of a map if you don't have a D&D map available.
You could certainly do that. In fact, one of my favorite patrons at my library has a habit of coming in and taking like 3 or 4 board games and mashing them together to run his own style of Dungeons and Dragons. So he'll use the monsters from the Dark Souls game as his miniatures, and he'll use the tiles from Battle Sheep, and he'll use like different elements from the Harry Potter board game, and he'll use them in different and unique ways to be able to make his own game that he runs for Dungeons and Dragons. Again, that's the whole idea of doing a DIY for your programs. When you're making the miniatures yourself and when you're adapting existing, board games or existing game pieces, that is one of the great things about D&D. It's infinitely versatile, and it makes you very creative.
Excellent. Speaking of creativity, we had some comments that came in to the panelists that we'll share with everybody. Someone was saying that D&D can tie really nicely into arts and crafts for those who are teachers and library staff. Kids can make art about the characters or the locations. They can take the events of the game and turn it into a story, write the character's backstory, the opportunity for cosplay, to make costumes and dress up as their characters.
Cosplay. You can also do programs where you actually, and if your library has a 3D printer, this is literally the best use for it. You can create STL files for your students or your patrons, and you can actually create 3D printed miniatures for them that they then get to paint themselves. That was actually a program I was planning for the summer before COVID-19 decided to eat that. So. Yep. Mark, if you're still with us, I'm still planning on that. Don't give up.
Yeah. And then we had somebody else who said that in real life, they keep their map on a magnetic whiteboard, and then the kids use different magnets that they make as their tokens.
That's ingenious.
And then somebody asking how to market D&D as a library program. They usually advertise it as a gaming program with some creative writing elements, but would love to hear other thoughts.
I mean, I'm going to be honest, a lot of the kids know Dungeons and Dragons. Like between The Big Bang Theory and Stranger Things and all of the different Dungeons and Dragons has had a major resurgence in the last few years. And I'm going to bet that most of your kids already know what D&D is. So if you say Dungeons and Dragons, they'll probably hop for it. That being said, if you're trying to aim it toward how to market it in a way that are going to make parents not like raise an eyebrow at it, I suggest doing it, expressing specifically the fact that it is a collaborative storytelling game. You know, it's a, you know, it's a storytelling experience where you're writing the story and acting it out in real time. I do strongly feel that D&D has a place as a creative writing tool. It's definitely something that can get kids creative and working. But if you just tell them Dungeons and Dragons, I can guarantee you'll have kids lining up for it.
Also suggestions to talk about the critical thinking, the
Yep.
STEAM aspects, the
Yep.
social intelligence aspects.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then somebody also points out that being honest to someone trying to figure out all of this in order to serve students, realistically, you need to at least know how to play before you start to Dungeon Master.
And if you have a friendly local gaming store in your area, there is a very good chance that they'll have access to Adventures League. I forgot to mention Adventures League. Talking about it now. The Adventures League is organized play created by Wizards of the Coast. What it is, it's a series of modules that are created by the folks at Wizards of the Coast and then put out in sort of like seasonal packets. So usually they have something to do with the most recent campaign guide that's been set out. So when the campaign guide for Curse of Strahd, which is a sort of gothic horror, vampires and sort of like, you know, Eastern European vibe, they had a number of adventures for the Adventurers League that were based in the realm of Barovia, where Strahd takes place. So if you have, as I said, a local gaming store, you can probably find someone who is in charge of setting up the Adventurers League organized play in that area. And if you don't, I bet you can find one that meets online.
Apparently that's just what somebody was doing when quarantine interrupted, was Strahd. So,
we're actually running our own Curse of Strahd game. It's fantastic. Speaking of DIY miniatures, we used a baby Groot bobblehead for a giant evil tree. No spoilers, but it was great.
That's great. Question for a library program, recommendations for maximum, minimum group size.
That is a challenging question because for a program that takes 2 to 4 hours, you want to try and get your money's worth, right? Here's the thing. You try and run Dungeons and Dragons with more than 6 people at a time, it is going to get super unwieldy. My mentor, the woman who introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons, would try her very best to run D&D with every kid that came to our nerdcore group. This was upwards of, 8, 12, 20 kids at a time. It became impossible to run games. Literally, it would take 1 2-hour session for us to get through 1 round of combat. It was impossible. So what I suggest is either be willing to run multiple sessions of Dungeons and Dragons on a semi-regular basis and allow for new kids to cycle in, or, and this is the thing that I love to do, if you can run it in person works better, which I know for right now that's not really reasonable. But if you can run it with kids grouping off, that is to say you have 3 kids and they are in charge of 1 player character. They get to create that character together. They get to decide who that character is. They just get to decide, their age and their gender and their race and their class and everything that makes them them. And then they as a table get to decide how their character interacts with the world that you build. That means you can take it from being only 6 kids to 6, 9, 12, 18 kids in a session. It takes a little bit of working and it takes a little bit of cooperation between the kids. But again, that's kind of like what the game is for, right? Is teaching cooperation. So that's a great way to try and get as many kids as possible into the game without overwhelming yourself. I would say anytime you run a game, no more than 6 player characters. Otherwise, things are going to get unwieldy.
Right, and then we had a couple suggestions about maybe having several games going on at once, if you can get some community volunteers or other staff to
Yes.
DM as well.
And that's one of the plans that we had for the fall in my library, was actually opening up an all ages Dungeons and Dragons program on a monthly basis. We'll see, if/when that happens, but I have the highest of hopes.
And then a question about a favorite moment that has happened in one of your D&D programs, a particularly battle, a really clever tactic that the kids used that caught you off guard. I know you've got lots of those. Pick your favorite.
I do. Oh, that's a hard question, and I should have had that. I knew someone was going to ask that, and I didn't think about it. I'm just gonna go with like the most recent one. So we had a game this last week where the kids were they were trying to return a fabled artifact to a temple, and in this mountain temple there were just traps in every room, and the kids finally got to a room that seemed like it was pretty normal. There was a button in the middle of the room, and there were 3 doors, and then they got to the big door on the other side, and the door wouldn't move. And then as soon as they touched the door, the other doors like locked, and all of a sudden there was this countdown, and the kids started freaking out. And one of the kids like pushed the button, and like everything went back to normal. I said all the doors were still closed, and the countdown had restarted. And watching these kids trying to figure out what to do, because like some of them were like, oh my gosh, something's coming, we're all gonna die, and like getting ready to fight. And some of them were just like kind of freaking out, like, oh, we're all gonna die, and I don't know what to do. And then one kid was just like desperately trying to figure out the puzzle, and they kept on pushing the button and resetting the timer and pushing the button and resetting the timer. And then they finally just let the timer run out. And there was a horrible shrieking sound, and darkness enveloped everything. And then everything was fine, and the doors all opened. It was, and I have to admit, I totally stole the idea from that for that encounter from Z Bashu, from the animated spell book. But it's a good one. And if your kids are new to Dungeons and Dragons, it's a great thing to throw them for the very first time. Because it's sort of like, you expect certain things to happen, and when they don't happen the way you expected, it's a great day.
We had somebody was asking if they could get the bit.ly link for the recorded version posted up again, or how that recording will be sent out, made available.
Sure. So I'm actually working with the person who posts our City of Littleton content. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and get the recording and clean it up a little bit, and then send it out through YouTube. So if you registered for this through the link that I sent out through like social media, or through the library's email newsletter, so long as your email list is on there, so long as your email is on the list, I will be sending it out. If you're not sure if you've registered or not, just go ahead and shoot me an email at the littletongov.org email address.
Perfect. A question about your favorite critical failure.
I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the Cloud Giant incident. So my character was a grave cleric, which means that, her whole spiel was, taking care of people until they're dead, and then taking care of them when they're dead and making sure they don't come back and things like that. So we had been put into a arena with this Cloud Giant, and all of the other players are trying to attack the Cloud Giant. I'm hiding behind a wall, just like pinging healing spells and trying to debilitate the giant as best I can. And that starts moving out of my range, and I can't cast spells more than 30 feet from myself. So I have to, run out into the open. I have to cast a spell to heal someone, and then I have no alternative. There's nowhere for me to hide. I'm exposed. And so my character looks at the Cloud Giant, looks at her party, and she's like, well, okay. And literally begins digging a hole. because I can't do anything else. The very next round, the cloud giant flings a boulder at me. And the way we narrated it was my character, looks around, says K, starts digging her own grave, looks up, sees the boulder coming at her. It smacks her. She just flat out dies. It hits her for more than twice her health points. She falls over into the grave, and the boulder is on top of her like a headstone. It was, without a doubt, the most ridiculous death I've ever had.
There you go. Oh, we had a fun suggested listening come into the panelist chat.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody listens to the Moth radio hour ever, they have fantastic live stories. And there's one apparently about combining Dungeons and Dragons and the game, The Oregon Trail, to teach westward expansion. So that's at the Moth.org stories, life and death on the Oregon Trail.
I'm writing that down.
I know, I typed it down already, dear. I'll send it to you.
Okay, cool. Yay.
You have to listen to that as
we
well.
We actually do a live play Oregon Trail, halfway between like an escape room and a life-size board game at the library in the fall, which I'm really hoping we get to do it this year. But if not, that's a great alternative.
All right. I think those are all of the questions, comments that have come in. If there's anything else, folks, feel free to go ahead and type it in. We did have one question early on about getting a certificate of attendance. If you need that for any timesheets or anything, go ahead and email either Emily, the libem at littletongov.org, or mine is libcm at littletongov.org. Use the super secret password Miss Emily Rocks, and we'll be happy to shoot you an email saying, yes, this person attended our webinar, because I don't think we thought.
I will literally like Photoshop like a fantastic rolled parchment scroll saying, hear ye, this individual hath attended How to Be a Dungeon Master.
Perfect. See, I'm not good for her. And then we also had questions about whether the chat will be available on the recording. We haven't done a webinar style before, so I'm not positive about that, but I did pull out all of the links as I saw them come through, and I've got those typed up in a separate document, so we'll make sure that those links go out if we find out that the chat doesn't actually come through. Oh,
if nothing else, I can save the chat and I can put that in at the end of the presentation slides.
Perfect. Any thoughts on Pathfinder or suggestions for a sci-fi flavored RPG?
Yes, Pathfinder is fantastic. I didn't talk about Pathfinder only because it is very Dungeons and Dragons adjacent. Really, the only difference is Pathfinder has, and I haven't played with 4th edition Pathfinder at all, so I don't know much about its newer iterations. But back in the early 2000s, the game flavor was Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition and 3.5 edition. And that was a very, very solid, if a little rules heavy game. And then Wizards of the Coast put out Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition, which I'm going to be honest, was almost universally lauded as the worst game ever made. And so Paizo created basically knockoff Dungeons and Dragons and called it Pathfinder. It had everything that Dungeons and Dragons had been, and then gave up for 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons. So Pathfinder is effectively an older version of Dungeons and Dragons that sort of split from the evolutionary tree and became its own thing. And it's a fantastic game. I'm not diminishing it at all when I say it's a great game. And when it comes to sci-fi, there is of course I think it's called Starfinder. There is a science fiction version of Pathfinder that you could very easily use and play. If you want sci-fi, or if you want specifically like space adventures, space opera and things like that, there are so many different possible games you can use. I actually, before 4th edition came out, I was actually in the process of creating a Dungeons and Dragons game where my players were literally like flying around in a sentient starship. And they would go to different planets, and each planet would have a different, biome and different monsters from the monster manual that were the indigenous species on that planet. And I'm really sad I never got to finish running that game with my friends. But high school happens.
So there's also a suggestion for Numenera.
Numenera is really great. I don't know if I thought it was Numeria. I don't know.
I have no idea. I'm reading it.
Monty Cook Games, I think, publishes that. But it's a sort of like high fantasy, sort of science fiction. It's a very elegant system. It's a very like beautiful and lore-rich story. It's really great. I would also strongly suggest Gamma World. Gamma World is a dystopian apocalypse story where the way that you make your characters is absolutely insane. You roll on a chart of all of these different sort of like horrible mutations you might have gotten from the nuclear apocalypse. And the best part is that one of the elements is swarm and one of the elements is feline. So you can literally be a swarm of kittens. It's amazing. So if you want like science fiction or stuff like that, Gamma World I really suggest is really fun.
Oh, and somebody said, ooh, speaking of cats, so there may be something else coming. Lovecraft and, well, Call of Cthulhu, yes.
Call of Cthulhu!
Yes, there is.
Yes, and Call of Cthulhu is another role-playing game that is very good. I would not, if you're a teacher or an educator, I don't suggest playing it with your students. First off, there's all like the problematic elements of Lovecraft as a human being, but it is also pretty intense. And while we're talking about cats, I just want to share Dungeon Meowster.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And being a dungeon master is very like herding cats. So, there are
entirely.
Right.
All right. If there's no other questions, again, if there's any questions in your mind going forward, or if you just want, suggestions or support for starting your own D&D group, please don't hesitate to email me. I am so happy to pass along my knowledge in the same way that my mentor passed it along to me. It's only fitting that, the librarian that taught me D&D sort of made me the next generation of librarians that teach D&D.
Seems extremely fitting.
There you go.
And now I am being swarmed by my one cat as she tells me, really, it's time for dinner.
Jasa. All right.
Thank you all so much
for joining us. If there's no other questions, we'll let you go. Thank you so much, folks. Have a great night.